good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us here for the fourth of 5 reports on Chinese-Russian relations in the Indo-Pacific. And this one is on Russia's use of the instruments of power in the region. I'm Bob Hamilton. I'm the head of Eurasia Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I'm joined by Dr. Alexander Korolev, the author of the report, and by Dr. Michael Ruland of the Russia Strategic Initiative at U.S. European Command. So thanks, Alex, for your work on this report. Thanks, Mike and RSI for sponsoring this entire series. What we will do, we have an hour, and I wanted to turn it over to Alex to let him go through his main conclusions for the report. And then I'll act as a discussant. I've got, having read the report and read the slides that Alex will use, I've got some, just a few initial questions. We'll get to those and then turn it over to Dr. Mike Ruland to moderate the questions and answers. So Alex, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to share my research with you. Just give me a second, I'll share my slides. Zoom. Slightly different. Teams. Hold on a second. Okay, here we go. Share. All right. Can you see the slides? Yeah. Okay. I think the primary question that that drives this analysis is how Russia can not just remain afloat despite the war in Ukraine, but also do reasonably well in the sense of reading the regional and global geopolitical situation and navigate this rather complex geopolitical environment. And as you can gather from the title of my presentation and the report as well, Russia, I think, is quite good at identifying and using the complexity of the current geopolitical environment, and especially the challenges and problems that are faced by other countries in the region, including China, because China is the primary player here and Russia's close strategic partner, even though I think the consensus is that China is not Russia's ally. And what I was able to identify in this research is that Russia has established a rather complex pattern of behavior that consists of 2 different levels of foreign policy, if you like, 2 different levels of interacting with the small and big and small powers in the region and globally more broadly. And these 2 levels are systemic balancing and regional hedging. And before I start unpacking this configuration, this 2-level approach, I'll make you suffer through a couple of concepts to guide the analysis, because I'm an IR scholar. I'm not really an area expert in the traditional sense of the word. So I always try to confuse people with identifying patterns and general regularities. So what are these 2 primary modes of behavior, if you like? So balancing is a game of great powers. In international relations theory, balancing is directed against the strongest power or greatest threat in the international system. And the greatest threat tends to be the strongest power, which is the United States, and particularly for China and Russia. So it's kind of a very linear behavior aimed at restraining, constraining, balancing against the most powerful player in the international system. And hedging is more complex. Hedging is a mess. It's a kind of situational, multidimensional, multi-directional mix of versatile day-to-day policies in various areas of state interests. And it involves great powers, smaller powers. It also includes counteracting policies. I think one of the colleagues defined it as an engage and resist strategy. So engagement and resistance happening at the same time. It's a mix of balancing and engagement, cooperation and competition. So states utilize hedging to diversify its economic and security bets. So it consists of both agreements and disagreements, and it spreads over different issue areas. And if we try to visualize it, then balancing, as I mentioned, involves large powers. So if you look at the first figure on the top, we can imagine that the unipole is the United States, and great power one and great power two are China and Russia, basically. And it's driven by power distribution in the international system and the perceptions of threats by the major players. And hedging is a kind of milieu in which this great power relations unfold, and it's driven by proximate geographical environments, interests in the immediate geopolitical environment, economic interests, and so on and so forth. So balancing is kind of a systemic structural pattern that is always there. It's like a law of gravity in physics. So my argument, how is it relevant, right, to Russia's to the way Russia uses instruments of power in the Indo-Pacific, is that Russia plays these two modes of behavior quite well, I think, and this explains why, despite all the hopes by Russia's opponents, it still manages to not only survive the sanctions and the isolation by the West, but also it manages to find alternative cooperation opportunities, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. And the point is that despite the war in Ukraine, worsening US-China relations, growing concerns over China's rise in the Indo-Pacific, and more recently, the significant shifts in US foreign policy, all these factors created new regional hedging opportunities for Russia. So these three primary factors, I would say. So it's US-China intensifying rivalry, and the prediction is that it's going to intensify. And I think it's not easy to reverse US-China relations and to put them on a more positive track, because again, it's a structural tendency. It's about balancing, and Russia understands that. And the growing concerns over China's rise is another important factor. Southeast Asian states, such as Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia, and India is another big player here. They're all concerned about China's growing assertiveness in the South China Sea and beyond, more globally. And but at the same time, they're cautious. They don't want to antagonize China beyond the point of no return. So they know that a closer alignment with the US would mean antagonizing China beyond the point of no return. So it creates a rather complex structure of incentives and push and pull forces that give Russia those hedging opportunities in the Indo-Pacific. They see Russia as a useful alternative, even though Russia might not be the best ally to counter China. But Russia is a major player, and it has good relations with China, and it provides extra channel of communication with China. And for countries that do not want to sort of transition into direct confrontation with China, they're interested in improving, sort of maintaining and even enhancing cooperation with Russia. So let's unpack these two modes sort of empirically and in greater detail. Speaking of systemic balancing, Russia has aligned with China. I think Russia has used China's concerns in Southeast Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, quite effectively. For example, beyond its own balancing acts against the West, so to speak, Russia kind of mirrored and chimed into, if you like, this China's balancing behavior in the region. For example, Moscow has viewed earlier US's policies of rebalancing to Asia as a way for Washington to maintain its global hegemony and to contain China. And Moscow adopted this rhetoric and signaled it to China that we're on the same page. And when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, we're also concerned about those different initiatives by the United States, like rebalancing to Asia earlier, then this free and open in the Pacific, which is from China's perspective is a loaded concept. The moment you add free and open in the Pacific, stop being just an innocent geographical term. It's a geopolitically charged concept. Moscow also has been explicitly against US's kind of meddling, as they put it, in the South China Sea. They viewed it as undermining ASEAN centrality, and that it elevates the issue of territorial disputes between China and the smaller states to the level of system level confrontation between China and the US. Also, kind of the rhetoric that came from Moscow criticized internationalization of the South China Sea dispute. And again, if we translate it into like language between China and Russia, internationalization means US interference or participation in the South China Sea dispute. Sergei Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, said that it's necessary to terminate any meddling by external regional countries into the negotiations taking place between the direct participants of the dispute, and to stop any attempts to internationalize the issue. So this is, I think, Russia or China takes this rhetoric very well. It likes it a lot. That China is a proponent of bilateral approach to the South China Sea dispute. It doesn't like negotiating with groups of countries, be it within ASEAN or any other groupings. It really likes one-on-one contacts, and the reason why is rather clear, because China is a bigger power, and when bigger power negotiates with smaller powers, then it has an upper hand. Moscow's position on the Hague Tribunal at this arbitration on South China Sea is quite interesting. I think this is an example of how to frame it in a way that everyone at the very least doesn't resist it or has nothing against to say. Moscow supported China sort of by saying that China has the right to ignore the tribunal ruling, and that and all of that it's an institution of the hostile West, and it's an attempt to isolate China. But at the same time, Moscow never really supported the territorial claims per se. So there is nothing in the official rhetoric coming from Moscow saying that China has historical rights on those particular islands or rocks or maritime territories in the South China Sea. So again, we see here that at the systemic level, Moscow supported China in the South China Sea, and by the systemic level, I mean that yes, China should ignore it. It's about it's all U.S. conspiracy and an attempt to put pressure on China. And on this, in terms of this, Moscow is on the same page with China, but at the same time, it's rather ambiguous and ambivalent when it comes to the territorial claims that China might have, and the territorial claims of those smaller states in Southeast Asia. And Putin also explicitly on multiple occasions stated that China is not a threat and that China is not a source of concern for Russia. That China is clearly becoming a global power, has become a global power, but at the same time, it's not a threat and Russia wants to cooperate. So we see this systemic balancing level in which Moscow kind of is on the same page with China, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, and it reflects and adopts and amplifies China's concerns, global concerns in the Indo-Pacific. I think what's more interesting is what's happening at the level of regional hedging, what I call regional hedging. And this is Russia. This is where Russia tries to diversify its partnerships in Asia. Whether it works well or not, I think it is an empirical question. I think the outcome is rather mixed, but it's not completely ineffective. It's rather effective when it comes to finding some cooperation opportunities, or at least maintaining what Russia used to have in the region before its invasion of Ukraine. So, and here we can see that we can see Russia's cooperation with Vietnam, about which I will say a few more words in a couple of minutes. India, and these partnerships constitute a hedge, again, that helps Russia diversify its economic and security bets in the region. The key question here, and this is something very common in these discussions, is whether it's against China and how China takes it, right? So, and a rather common argument is that this is the kind of source of divergences between China's and Russia's interest, and that, well, if you look at it, if you sort of put hedging at the same level of systemic balancing, and you look at it in like, it does look like it's a policy against China, because if Russia sells advanced weapons to Vietnam and Vietnam has dispute with China, and Vietnam is most likely to use those weapons, let's say, to protect its interest in the South China Sea, then it might look like it's against China, it's to balance China in the region. However, the problem is that this line of reasoning sort of underestimates the factor of systemic balancing between China and the United States. So from China's standpoint, of course, China is concerned about Vietnam or India having more weapons, Russian weapons, and which sort of, if not tips the balance in favor of those countries, but gives China some headache. However, what is the alternative? And from Beijing's standpoint, the alternative is that if Russia stops, let's say, put it bluntly, stops its cooperation or reduces the scope of its cooperation, let's say, with India or Vietnam, as smaller states, particularly Vietnam and other Southeast Asian states, they will turn to the U.S. And U.S. might fill the void. U.S. tried to enhance strategic partnership with Vietnam few years ago, which Vietnam rejected, and that was quite an interesting episode. And China was extremely concerned about it. So from China's standpoint, it's better to have Russia arming Vietnam and India than a less friendly Western power, let's say the United States. So for China, it's kind of a least worst case scenario, if we could put it that way. Yes, it is concerned about Russia's kind of inroads into the Indo-Pacific, but at the same time, it's it prefers to see Russia because at least the Chinese can talk to the Russians. Also, the recent factor of Donald Trump, I think, has contributed a layer of complexity to this hedging circumstances in the Indo-Pacific, because those Indo-Pacific states became more concerned. They were not particularly keen, like India, let's say, to become like a de facto ally of the U.S. in the region. But now the concerns are higher, and they're more likely to basically to continue hedging and to cooperate with Russia. And just a couple of examples. This is the 20th of June of 2024. In the media, there was a lot about two dictators, Putin and Kim Jong-un, shaking hands in North Korea, kind of emerging as a new authoritarian axis of power and all of that. But what was neglected is that right after North Korea, Putin's plane landed in Hanoi. Literally, I think they went directly to Hanoi, or maybe they went back to Russia, but it was very tightly scheduled visits. Basically, it was a state visit by Putin to Vietnam 2 years into invasion of Ukraine, and Vietnamese President Tho Lam said something something interesting. He said he thanked Putin for his contribution to peace, stability, and development in the world. Which is a kind of interesting. Promised that the two countries would push up economic security and defense cooperation to create a reliable security architecture in the region. So, why is Vietnam doing it? Well, again, the reason is that in this context of systemic balancing and regional hedging, it needs Russia to increase the level of uncertainty in its relations with China, because, again, aligning with the US would mean confrontation with China, but Russia is a kind of a partner of both, and Vietnam can talk to China through Russia, and there is a lot going on. If we look at India, India is another interesting case, actually. Modi visited Russia twice in 2024 and gave Putin a bear hug every time he visited Moscow, and appreciated dear friend Putin for his commitment to Russia-India relations, which has been tested multiple times and has emerged very strong each time. Not only Modi gave Putin a bear hug, but also India increased if trade with Russia. If you look at the data, it's quite remarkable. Right after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what happened to Russia-India trade? It's like increased like sevenfold within a year or so, or 2 years. And again, we know, of course, what's going on here. It's the India is buying Russian oil, refining that oil, and sells it to NATO member states. So this is India has contributed to the so-called refining loophole, if you like. So and the mechanism here is quite interesting. Basically, saying that India, the way it works is that India increased imports of Russian oil, refine that oil, exports it all over the world, including to NATO member states, which I've added this slide because it's appeared after I submitted my slides, but I found it quite remarkable. It's from the recent BBC reports that actually NATO states buy Russian energy, spend like $300 billion on buying Russia's fossil fuels, and which far surpasses its aid to Ukraine. And India has played a significant role here. So India basically helped to thwart the Western isolation of Russia. And very briefly about China, again, I've mentioned a few factors here, why China does what it does. I think here, again, it's a growing recognition in Beijing that US and China are on the collision course. If you look at US strategic guidelines, the third offset strategy, national security strategy, Quad, AUKUS, and all of that, then clearly China is explicitly identified as a primary security concern. Taiwan is another issue in the post-Ukraine world after Russia invaded. I think 10 days after the invasion, Mike Pompeo visited Taiwan and said that we will take necessary and long overdue steps to do the right and obvious thing, which means to recognize free and independent Taiwan. And 5 months after Russia invaded Ukraine, Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, and Beijing protested vehemently. It staged military drills in the Taiwan Straits. And another factor is what I call India hypocrisy. Actually, the way so no one has ever accused India of supporting Russia. At least, well, there are some statements, but it's nowhere close to the geopolitical pressure that US and its allies tried to put on Beijing. And for China, it means one simple thing, is that it's not about Ukraine. It's, again, we're back to systemic balancing. So the Ukraine war is being used to put pressure on China. So conclusion, through this analysis, I've discovered that at the level of systemic balancing, China is Russia's primary strategic ally. Russia sides with China on various issues that aid Russia's anti-US balancing attempts and aids China's anti-US balancing attempt. And China reciprocates well because it also balances against the US. However, while balancing together with China at the systemic level, Russia tries to hedge its regional economic and security bets by expanding cooperation with as many countries as possible. Again, we can talk about how successful this hedging strategy has been, but I think there are some positive for Russia, positive outcomes out of it. It seeks to export energy, arms, agricultural products, machinery, technologies to different Asian markets. And what's the most interesting is that the amount of balancing and hedging in a great power strategy is a variable rather than a constant. The further US-Russia and US-China relations deteriorate, and hence great power rivalry intensifies, the more prominent the balancing dynamic is likely to be, limiting space available for hedging and vice versa. But as I mentioned, there is a lot of uncertainty now around US's foreign policy, around what Southeast Asian states and India's are up to, and this creates this uncertainty that is conducive to the continuation of this hedging policy. Okay, I think I've exhausted my time, and I'll stop here. And thank you very much for your attention.
Okay.
Sharing my screen. Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for that. I think it was a great overview of the report. Audience members, I would encourage you to drop your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to them. But I have a few questions I wanted to pose to you, Alex, after having read the report and seen your discussion of it. So, you had a quote from Putin in one of your slides about the evolving multipolar world order, right? The shift away from what the Chinese and Russians describe as US hegemony toward a multipolar system. So I wanted to ask you, how do Beijing and Moscow see this emerging multipolarity? Who are the poles? What role, for instance, does Beijing assign Russia in the new multipolar world? What role does Russia assign itself? And do they see multipolarity in the same way?
Well, that's an interesting question. Look, I think there is no in Moscow, Beijing, there is no a clear model of what multipolarity might look like, because this is this is a rhetorical device, I think, that basically, which is intended to create this common denominator in U.S.-China relations. Multipolarity basically means kind of the end to unipolarity, which was another popular rhetorical device in Moscow and Beijing after the end of the Cold War, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And multipolarity is a synonym of US's global dominance. And even though I think the power structure within the international system has changed, this multipolarity is a very convenient, I think, rhetorical tool that signals that normatively and in terms of their relationship with the West, China and Russia are more or less on the same page. It's more of a I see it's quite empty. If you want me to name the poles that they want to see, or the actual configuration that, or how multipolarity is supposed to materialize, I don't see much there. Actually, China is interested more in G2 at some point. I think China wants to claim its space, its place as number two, or at some point into the future, probably number one great power. And China was quite positive about. It was under Obama, I think, this G2 rhetoric, and but this thing, look, during the power transition, and again due to systemic balancing, this thing doesn't work well. G2, this is another kind of fake kind of trope, if you like, definition that never materialized. So I don't see any clear materialization of multipolarity. I think for Beijing and for Russia, the similarity is that it's kind of a world in which the institutions of the non-West are more prominent, and that China has a bigger say in the global financial institutions, let's say, and Russia simply views it as an anti-West rhetorical device, and they're quite different. Again, China is more interested in becoming a global power and to be recognized as a global power, and this is Beijing's interpretation of multipolarity. And for Moscow, multipolarity again is the kind of the end of what Moscow sees its isolation and the Western dominance. So these are very vague categories, and there are similarities, which is again anti-US, anti-West component of it, but there are also differences. But for Beijing, multipolarity is actually bipolarity or unipolarity, with Beijing on the top of it.
Yeah, so that's why I asked that question, because I've wondered that, and I've read that they actually, although they use multipolarity as a rhetorical device to argue against what they call U.S. hegemony, what the U.S. would call the rules-based order or the liberal world order, whatever, their visions for what this post-hegemonic world will look like are fundamentally different. Whereas, as you've said, China sees itself as a peer, a global power, and its only peer is the U.S., and believes that all other centers of power are minor, or they're smaller powers in the system. Whereas clearly Russia doesn't subscribe to that view of multipolarity, right? I think Moscow believes it would be a co-equal pole with whatever other poles there were: Beijing, Washington, maybe Brussels, maybe Delhi. Is that fair to say, though?
Yes, I would say so, even though I do think Russia also, despite the fact that it doesn't have the economic weight, Russia does want to see itself also as a kind of an equal power, at least when it comes to geopolitics, and it tries to behave as a great power, which quite often ends up in a disaster. But this is it's a fair assessment, I guess. I wouldn't say it's fundamentally different, because again, I said the similarity is that both don't want to see this U.S. hegemony or rules-based order, and they want to modify, transform that. So in this sense, there are similarities. But again, of course, China considers itself as a peer competitor, and this is where those interpretations diverge, I think.
Okay. Let me ask you about the hedging behavior you describe on the part of Russia. So as the region, it seems to me the region is really bifurcating into mutually exclusive security blocks with the increased engagement of the U.S. You mentioned the Obama, well, you mentioned the rebalance, which was actually a Obama first administration strategy that subsequent administrations, especially this current one, the Trump administration, have tried to accelerate. And then you've got the Quad, there's AUKUS, there's the U.S. engagement to internationalize the South China Sea dispute. So part one of the question is, how much does that reduce this sort of the increasing U.S.-China tension, reduce Russia's maneuver room to hedge, right? Because hedging requires maneuver. Yeah. You have to be able to maneuver. And is this decreasing Russia's ability to hedge?
Yes, that was my interpretation up until recently, actually. And I published a few pieces on that. And my argument was that, yes, exactly what you've just said, that this intensifying US-China confrontation and Russia's increasing isolation by the West contributes to this clear sort of this pattern of balancing growing and space for hedging shrinking. I've even published an article titled "Shrinking Room for Hedging." But recently, what I see indicates, to me at least, is that there is still significant hedging space, surprisingly. And again, this is, I think, as I mentioned, there are two factors contributing to that. And one important factor is the Indo-Pacific states' growing concerns about China's assertiveness and about China's becoming more aggressive in the South China Sea, and simultaneous interest in cooperation with China, especially economically. So Southeast Asian states, they want China's money, China's investments. They want, they jumped on this BRI initiative. They were extremely skeptical, and like, let's say, Indonesia was even against AUKUS. The official statement that came from Indonesia was that exactly what also you just mentioned. It's AUKUS will consolidate or contribute to the consolidation of this binary structure in the region, in which, like, on the one side we have US and its allies, and on the other side there is China, and we're against that. So I think that these multiple factors, so US-China rivalry, and the growing concerns of the Indo-Pacific states and their simultaneous, being interested in cooperating with China opens up new room for hedging. And I think this Modi's visits to Moscow and what India has been doing, and Vietnam and even Indonesia, like Russia, even though Russia failed to establish a military base in Indonesia, the mere fact of those negotiations taking place, I think is a significant indicator that there is still space to hedge. So I think, yes, there is an element of that Russia might face a tough choice at some point, and will need to make tough decisions. But again, if we look at China, China is in a tricky situation as well. So China understands that it has no allies. It has this so-called non-alignment policy, which probably paid off in the 1990s and early 2000s, is now many in China criticize that great power cannot be without allies. Many colleagues also they speak against this non-alignment policy. So China is in a quite tricky geopolitical situation when it faces the United States, but it doesn't have reliable allies. And this again opens up a hedging space for Russia. So I think And Trump again, Donald Trump is another factor here that I think undermined a certain amount of trust in the U.S. as an ally. I'm not saying that it's necessarily against the U.S.'s interest, but this is a different issue we can talk about. But the outcome is that now India, Vietnam, and other states look at the U.S. thinking like, okay, look at this guy, you know. If something happens between us and China, we're not sure that U.S. will fight and die for, let's say, to fix a territorial dispute with China. So yes, there is a paradoxical kind of configuration, is a growing weight of balancing, but at the same time, the most recent developments indicate that there is still some room for Russia to hedge.
Okay. So one last question, and then I'll turn it over to Michael for the audience questions. And that also, this question is about Russia's hedging behavior. You mentioned Vietnam and India specifically. Is there any currently ongoing Russian hedging behavior of this type, or anything Russia is likely to do in the future that really gets under the skin of people in Beijing? Is there a specific type of Russian behavior? You mentioned that, you know, the view from Beijing often is, well, better Russia than the US in terms of partnership with India or Vietnam. But is there a specific country, a specific type of Russian behavior that's more offensive than others to the PRC?
Uh, Hypothetically, yes. Well, North Korea, for example, I think, and uh, anything related to North Korean nuclear program, and Russia making any bold moves to share nuclear technologies with North Korea, which might embolden North Korea uh, to take its own bold moves, right? So this is something I think that will really stretch the limits of Beijing's patience, especially when it comes to nuclear testing and nuclear capabilities. But look, I think the reality is that even though Moscow may not coordinate, even though I do think that with North Korea there is some tacit green light from Beijing. So even though Moscow is not probably discussing every step it makes with China, it's quite careful. Moscow also understands that antagonizing China again due to the systemic balancing level that I mentioned, antagonizing China is not in Moscow's interest. So it will be very careful not to really push it too far with Beijing, and to try. Well, whether Russia is capable of doing that is a different question. But I think it will try to find this fine line, this balance in which it doesn't cross the red lines with Beijing. Again, the question is, what are those red lines? And I think one way to do that is to keep the conversation with Beijing going. And I think there is a quite developed and institutionalized mechanism of bilateral consultations between them. And I think, as I mentioned, even though they might not be coordinating every step, there is a lot of talking going on and signaling, and Moscow watches Beijing's reaction. And I think, given the fact that Russia needs China and depends on China, it will trot along politely, I think, and try not to antagonize Beijing. But yes, hypothetically, I think nuclear weapons, nuclear technologies for North Korea might be such.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Alex. And Michael, let me turn it over to you to moderate the Q&A
Okay.
from the audience. We have some questions in the
Yeah,
Q&A box already.
excellent. And I'll weave a couple extra in here that I have as well. So maybe this follows from the last question, but you've been, Alexander, you've been really working, you've been doing excellent work for the past decade, really on, a lot of different aspects of this Russia-China relationship. And I think that what you've described in this report is a very stable approach to the balancing. The hedging is where you see a lot more dynamism, right, in terms of Russian foreign policy engagements. What's surprised you What is an example of hedging that you think really surprised you when you look at that? And maybe not to take the North Korea example that you were just talking about, but is there something else that you could talk about?
Yes, there are a few things that surprised me. India is a surprise for me, honestly. I felt before the war in Ukraine, I thought that U.S.-India strategic cooperation is deeper and broader and more reliable, more stable. I was surprised to see how easy it is for India to show complete defiance to the principles of that partnership. And many in the US called India, some reports I've read, like underwhelming strategic partner. But India's approach and the kind of how bluntly India continues helping Russia, not just cooperating with Russia, but helping Russia. I mentioned this oil trade situation. I thought India would be. I didn't expect that India would impose sanctions, join the anti-Russia sanctions, or that India would sort of start criticizing and blaming Russia for the invasion and for this behavior of a spoiler. But I was surprised to see how far India is willing to go to actually to continue its partnership with Russia and actually to thwart the Western isolation. And Modi going to Moscow twice in 2024 in front of the whole world. And even though the Western media tried not to make a big deal out of it, it was a surprise for me. Also, kind of the Vietnamese president saying that Putin has contributed to peace and stability in the region and the world was quite surprising. That's why I even reversed my recent argument a bit, because my recent argument was that the room for hedging is shrinking, and what I see now is actually the opening up of the hedging space. But I see Moscow. I'm not saying it's Putin particular, but let's say policymakers in Moscow must have a very, very strong instincts about the situation in Southeast Asia and how to play it up in its favor. Also, what surprised me is U.S.'s foreign policy, and again, it's a slightly different territory. I don't want to step into that right now, but it is quite interesting to see the U-turn, even if rhetorical. But look, Hegseth and what's his name, Kellogg, saying that Europe is not going to be part of Ukraine peace process. This is also quite interesting. Again, I'm not saying that it's necessarily against hardcore realist interests of the U.S., because looks like the war in Ukraine is moving in the direction very catastrophic for the EU at least. But yeah, this view from this standpoint, it's justifiable what US is doing. But I think these factors, are quite surprising. Southeast Asia, particularly.
Okay, then maybe I'll tie in one of the audience questions here on BRICS. Where do you see hedging opportunities in BRICS? And then we'll try to move into a speed round now, because we have only a few minutes for each question left.
BRICS, yes. Look, it is a hedging space. Well, what is BRICS is I would say Shanghai Cooperation Organization probably is even more substantive and substantial than BRICS, because Russia dragged India into it, China dragged Pakistan into it, and making it a very interesting arena with these states as a part of it. So, yeah, I think this is another attempt to hedge, I would say, especially bringing states with different interests into it.
Yeah. And then there's a question here on reactions. So the Indo-Pacific Four, so Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea. How are they responding to this behavior, particularly with the DPRK that you've discussed?
Well, clearly they express concerns. Australian Prime Minister traveled to Indonesia like instantly, immediately after those military base negotiations between Indonesia and Russia. So there is a source of concern, and the problem is there is a divide, I think, in the Pacific. There are U.S.'s core allies, the countries you mentioned, but there are also those that hedge themselves, and this again creates more hedging opportunities for Russia. But again, also I think Indo-Pacific states understand that Russia is not a primary threat for them. I think China is the bigger fish to fry there, and as long as they approach Russia pragmatically, and they think that it's for them is an extra opportunity to hedge against China.
Okay, good. And on China specifically and a Taiwan crisis, how do you envision in that relationship? What would China expect of Russia? What kind of support? How would they expect Russia to behave, etc.?
That's a good question. I don't think China would expect Russia's. Let's say China makes a bold move towards Vietnam. I don't think China would expect Russia's direct military participation. I think Xi Jinping will want to cash the check, so to speak, for China's support of Russia during the war in Ukraine. And I think Beijing would expect something similar, maybe discounted energy, some weapon systems, anything that falls short of direct military participation. So I don't think there is an expectation that Russia will fight there or will be involved directly. So yeah.
And maybe just to press that, acting in other ways, that is to say, it doesn't have to be geographically isolated to Taiwan specifically, but it could be the wider region, it could be globally.
Could be
what
globally,
would China
expect? Yeah, support of China's in the international institutions, at least. I think a mirror image of what China has been doing during Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. I think that would satisfy Beijing. So when basically Russia is not pushed to, defend China publicly, but when Russia might veto certain anti-China resolutions in the U.S. or to block some sanctions or to come up with whatever mechanisms to undermine the Western sanctions, so or bypass, maybe not undermine, but at least bypass potential sanctions. I think this is in the toolkit, or this is kind of the kind of response that China would expect, sort of support, but not direct participation. Working with China to bypass potential Western sanctions and all of that.
Okay, and then maybe as a final audience question here, so are there specific technologies? There's one suggested as booster technology in rockets. Other technologies that you would highlight that you would think would sort of cross the line? Some technologies that China does not want Russia to give to North Korea.
Well, that's maybe some kind of artillery and missiles that can keep the balance in the favor of North Korea vis-a-vis South Korea. I'm not sure about specific technologies, but yeah, Russia is quite strong when it comes to short-range, mid-range missiles also. So I think in this area, Russia can be an asset for North Korea, and this might be a concern. Might change the balance of power in the region, and also like maybe drones. Russia recently sort of build up its capabilities, not without China's help, even again, though indirect help to produce military drones. I think giving the geographical proximity between, well, the common border between South Korea and North Korea, this is, I think for North Korea, the game is how much damage it can hypothetically do to South Korea. It's not necessarily about a nuclear war between United States and North Korea. I don't think that's a feasible scenario, but Seoul is very close. So like military technologies that strengthen North Korea's short-range, mid-range capabilities, I think, can also be a concern.
Great. I'll hand it back to you, Bob.
So thanks, Michael, and thanks, Alex, for the paper and for your excellent overview presentation of it. Mike, thanks for moderating the Q&A for us. Thanks to all of you who tuned in for this fourth in a series of 5 discussions sponsored by the Russia Strategic Initiative at U.S. European Command on Chinese-Russian relations in the Indo-Pacific region. The previous 3 papers in the series, the first one examined Chinese and Russian interests and influence in the region. The second one examined China's use of the instruments of power, instruments of statecraft. The third one was on a subject that we got into a little bit here today, which was the China, Russia, North Korea relationship. Alex's paper, which we just discussed today, is out on our website, so please go check it out. And then stay tuned, because later this month, we'll present the final paper and the final webinar in the series, which is about convergence and divergence of Chinese and Russian interests looking forward in the region. Alex is one of the co-authors for that. So again, thank you to everybody. And stay tuned for more on this subject later this month from FPRI.
Thank you.